imagine that you're just greedy, and self-centered, and that you want the most for you. So we won't be too optimistic about your motivations. And I don't think that most people are like that, by the way. I think that people are, by and large, pretty good at reciprocal interactions. And they do like to have, nice things for themselves, but they're often hard on themselves. But they care about the people they love, and they care about their families, and they're pretty good at reciprocal interaction with other people too. So I don't think we are just innately selfish to the core. It doesn't work. But let's assume you are for a moment. Well, and then let's assume that, there's a bunch of things you don't know how to do, and there's some people out there who have some talent that might be able to do them, and if they did them, then you'd get to benefit. Like you don't know how to make an iPhone. Well, some of you might, not the whole thing, but, some people know how to make an iPhone, and you get to have one. And so stopping someone who could make an iPhone from making one for some arbitrary reason because of their sex or their ethnicity or their race just seems completely counterproductive. And it's pretty obvious if you look around the world and you look at countries that are developing economically. Here's one good indicator. The countries that have, there's a very powerful relationship between the rights granted to women and the economic viability of a given country. It's very tightly associated. So that's quite cool, because it seems to indicate, well, maybe openness to the participation of women in traditional societies is also an indicator of openness to the new, to the novel. And so that's a good predictor of economic success. Or maybe it's that women have 50% of the talent, and we could use the damn talent, so how about we invite them into play too? That seems perfectly reasonable. And the same goes for, as I said, for ethnicity and for race. And so I think you have to be a damn fool not to open up the hierarchies to those who are competent, right? To the maximal possible degree, and that it's an error not to do that. But to insist that the outcome is the same is like, it's vile as far as I'm concerned, for a variety of reasons. The first reason is there's no indication that any attempt to do that in the 20th century ended up in any other manner than catastrophe. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, think it through. Think it through. It's like, okay, 50% of every occupation has to be men and women. Okay, you're really willing to do that, are you? And we could start with bricklayers. It's like, how are you going to do that? You're going to start forcing girls when they're like 13 to learn to lay bricks? And how are you going to force them to do that? Because maybe they're not interested. I can tell you something that's quite interesting about the STEM fields in women. So as societies become more egalitarian, so their equality of opportunity legislation is more widespread and arguably more effective. And so that would be in countries like Australia, but more particularly in countries like the Scandinavian countries, because they've taken it farther than anywhere else. Fewer women go into the STEM fields. Fewer, not more. And so if you rank order countries by how free women are, there's a negative relationship with how probable it is that they'll go into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. Now, and the evidence for that is very, very strong, by the way. This isn't just a few casual studies. These are large-scale international studies with tens of thousands of participants, replicated multiple times by researchers who did not expect to find that nor want it. So it's reliable. Okay, so why? Well, there's a bunch of different theories. One is that the average IQ of men and women is the same, and that's quite clear. But the male curve is flatter than the female curve, and that's the, what do they call that? The enhanced male variability hypothesis, which has almost now become impossible to publish on because it's politically incorrect. And what it suggests is that there are more men at the very upper end of the intelligence distribution and more men at the very lower end. And that explains some things, like why there are far more boys, for example, who have learning disabilities than there are girls. And there's some evidence that men are more neurologically vulnerable than women because they're more specialized neurologically. And the advantage to that is this enhanced variability, but the disadvantage is the specialization makes them less robust and resilient neurologically. Be that as it may. That's one possibility. And I think there's a fair bit of evidence for that. And it's often the case that differences at the extreme, even if there aren't differences in the middle, differences at the extreme actually make a big difference. You know, because like, let's say you're going to be an engineer. Maybe one person in 100 is an engineer. And you have to be really interested in gadgets to be an engineer. You know, you have to be more interested than 99 out of 100 people to be an engineer. And there's not that many people that are like that. And most of them happen to be men. Now, people have criticized the male variability hypothesis because they've looked at the performance of girls in mathematics in junior high school. And it turns out that girls do pretty much as well as boys do in mathematics in high school, in junior high, at the upper end. And so those would be the people you'd expect to go into the STEM fields, right? Because they have the, what would you call it? They have the intellectual ability for it. But what you see is that the women who have high mathematical ability also tend to have high verbal ability. Whereas the men that have high mathematical ability tend to have less high verbal ability. And so one of the things that implies is that the women who have high mathematical ability have more vocational choice. And so they're statistically less likely to go into the STEM fields. So that's kind of an interesting. No one expected that, so that's kind of an interesting observation. And then there's another observation too that's also extraordinarily germane. There's a variety of ways of looking at the psychological differences and similarities between men and women. And the first thing that you might want to know is that men and women are more similar than they are different on all the personality dimensions. So the overlap is quite strong. The biggest differences are, there's 5 personality dimensions. I mentioned them: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. The biggest differences are in neuroticism. Women are higher in negative emotion, and that kicks in at puberty, because it's not the case for boys and girls. And they're higher in agreeableness, which is partly why there are far more men in prison. Which is another thing we might think about. Is like, what is that? Is that gender discrimination, precisely? Now, I'm bloody well dead serious about this. I went to a NATO conference 25 years ago, and there were a group of female scientists there who claimed that the psychiatric diagnostic criteria for childhood conduct disorder should be revamped because there were far more boys diagnosed with childhood conduct disorder than there were girls. And that's the precursor, by the way, to adult antisocial personality disorder or to criminality. And the way that you equate it by sex, if you want to do that, is you get rid of the violence. So one of the criteria for childhood conduct disorder is kicking, hitting, biting, and stealing, like criminal behavior. If you take that out of the diagnostic criteria, then you get the same number of boys and girls. And that's what they were advocating for 25 years ago. And I thought, you people are completely out of your bloody minds. Because the only reason that we ever came up with the diagnosis for childhood conduct disorder was because we were worried that the violent kids would become violent adolescents and that they would become violent adults, which is exactly what happens, by the way, because aggressive behavior is unbelievably stable and difficult to alter. But they were perfectly willing to gerrymander the diagnostic criteria so that the sex difference disappeared, even though that would completely invalidate the utility of the diagnosis. And their fundamental claim was the reason that there were more men in prison than women was because it was a form of arbitrary prejudice, and that this is absolutely insane. So, you know, it is the case, if you look at domestic violence statistics, by the way, women hit men more than men hit women, just so you know. It actually doesn't matter mostly. Not that it's pleasant, that isn't what I'm saying, is that men are a lot stronger than women. They have a lot more powerful upper bodies. And so when men hit women, the consequences tend to be very dire, and when women hit men, well, they're less dire. And I'm not saying that it's okay, but I am pointing out that, you know, this does happen. Relationship between your own psychological structure, whatever that happens to be, your own value hierarchy, because there's a very tight relationship between your value hierarchy and your psychological structure, which is why hierarchies, by the way, are necessary, which which is part of the point I was trying to make, say, in Rule 1 in 12 Rules for Life when I talked about hierarchies. There's no getting away from hierarchies. Because a hierarchy is a structure that tells you that one thing takes precedence over another, that one thing is more important than another, right? And if everything is of equal import, then nothing is more important than anything else, by definition. And then, well, what should you do? And the answer is, well, you can't tell, because nothing is any more important than anything else. And the definition of important, fundamentally, is something like that which you should do first. You know, that constitutes importance. That's also something that's relevant, I would say, too, because a lot of the way that we look at the world is as a place to. We look at the world as a place in which to act, and we make a lot of judgments about the nature of the world in terms of how we should structure our action. In fact, the theory that I am putting forth in general is a theory that's predicated on the notion that the essential way that we look at the world is as if it's a forum of action, like a dramatic forum, like a story. That's a good way of thinking about it, that we really do view ourselves and our place in the world as a story that's set in a narrative landscape. And you know, you might argue that that's not the case. You could say, well, that viewpoint, for example, has been superseded by a scientific viewpoint, but it isn't obvious to me that that's the case. And it certainly isn't. It's certainly not the case that we act that way. And it's certainly not the case that we structure our political systems that way. And it's certainly not the case that we treat each other that way, or that we think that way, or that we react emotionally that way.